Have you ever wondered why the most difficult people in your life seem completely incapable of admitting a single mistake? It is a striking paradox. The individuals whose actions cause the most friction are often the most convinced of their virtue. This rigid certainty is not merely a social inconvenience. It is a profound psychological mystery that reveals the architecture of the ego. We have all encountered that one person who, despite a mountain of evidence, refuses to acknowledge an obvious error in judgment. They navigate the world with a strange kind of armor, seemingly immune to the common human experience of doubt or self-reflection. In conversations, they do not listen to understand, but rather to wait for a moment to reassert their personal version of reality. This behavior creates a confusing fog for those around them, leading many to question their own memory or sense of truth. Observers often find themselves exhausted, trying to reconcile the external facts with the impenetrable wall of the other person's absolute conviction. Why does the mind choose to prioritize being right over being connected, even when that choice leads to isolation and deep resentment? The gap between their perceived infallibility and their actual impact on others is a chasm that modern psychology is beginning to map. Throughout history, philosophers and students of the human soul have noted that the most toxic behaviors are often fueled by self-righteousness. Arthur Schopenhauer once remarked that every man takes the limits of his own field of vision for the limits of the world. This observation points toward a hidden psychological mechanism that prevents certain individuals from seeing beyond the narrow horizon of their own perspective. Thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche explored the idea that conviction can be a more dangerous enemy of truth than a lie could ever be. When a person believes they are the moral center of every situation, they stop observing reality and start projecting their internal desires. This is not a conscious choice for most, but a deep-seated defensive strategy designed to protect a very fragile sense of identity. By framing this behavior as a psychological survival tactic, we begin to see the tragic architecture behind what we call toxic personalities. We are about to look beneath the surface of this arrogance to find the mechanisms of perception, bias, and emotional self-protection. At the core of this rigid certainty lies the concept of cognitive dissonance, a state of mental tension that occurs when reality clashes. When a toxic person faces evidence that they have caused harm, the brain experiences a profound threat to its internal narrative of goodness. To resolve this pain, the mind quickly rewrites the history of the event to ensure the individual remains the hero or the victim. Sigmund Freud described these as defense mechanisms, automatic psychological processes that protect the ego from anxiety and the shame of being flawed. One of the most powerful tools in this arsenal is projection, where the individual attributes their own negative traits to those around them. If they are being manipulative, they will sincerely believe that it is you who is trying to control the narrative of the conversation. This is not necessarily a calculated lie. In their mind, the projection feels like a genuine observation of the external world around them. Daniel Kahneman's work on cognitive biases explains how the halo effect allows people to believe that because they are good, their actions are correct. The brain seeks consistency, and for someone with a high level of toxicity, admitting a mistake would shatter the consistency of their identity. They operate on a fast-thinking track where emotional security takes precedence over the slow, agonizing work of logical self-correction and honest reflection. Over time, these mental shortcuts become hardwired, creating a feedback loop where every conflict only serves to strengthen their belief in their own righteousness. They become trapped in what psychologists call the Dunning-Kruger effect, where they lack the very self-awareness needed to recognize their own lack of awareness. This psychological blindness is not a lack of intelligence, but a sophisticated bypass of the parts of the brain responsible for social empathy. The ego acts as a filter, allowing only information that supports its current status while discarding any data that suggests a need for change. The result is a person who is intellectually and emotionally static, unable to learn from the very friction they create in their relationships. In the modern workplace, this pattern manifests as the leader who takes credit for successes but blames the team for every minor failure. They do not see this as unfairness. They truly believe their vision was perfect and only the execution by others was flawed. In romantic relationships, this behavior creates a cycle of gaslighting, where the toxic partner denies the reality of the other person's feelings. By insisting they are right about how the other person should feel, they effectively erase the partner's autonomy to maintain their own control. You may see this in social media arguments where individuals retreat into echo chambers that validate their biases while demonizing any dissenting voice. The digital world provides a perfect laboratory for the toxic ego to flourish, rewarding certainty and punishing the nuance of intellectual humility. In family dynamics, the always right parent or sibling creates a hierarchy where their emotional comfort is the only metric that matters. They use their conviction as a weapon, making it so exhausting to disagree with them that others simply stop trying to speak their truth. This silence is often mistaken by the toxic person as agreement, further fueling their belief that their perspective is the only valid one. When confronted with a different viewpoint, they don't see a person with an opinion. They see a threat that must be neutralized immediately. Their language is filled with shits and absolute statements, leaving no room for the gray areas that define most human interactions and experiences. They often rely on the availability heuristic, focusing only on the few times they were right to justify their current, possibly incorrect, stance. Even in casual conversations about trivial matters, the need to win the point outweighs the desire for a pleasant and balanced social exchange. This constant state of combat leaves the people in their orbit feeling drained, unheard, and eventually, completely alienated from the toxic individual. Deeper psychological patterns reveal that this need for absolute correctness is often a mask for a profound, subconscious sense of worthlessness or shame. Carl Jung spoke of the shadow, the parts of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge and instead push down into the depths of the subconscious. For the toxic person, the shadow is filled with the fear of being wrong, which to them is synonymous with being unworthy of love. By never being wrong, they create a fortress where no one can hurt them, but they also ensure that no one can truly reach them. They mistake power for respect, believing that because people follow their lead or stop arguing, they have successfully demonstrated their superior insight. Robert Greene notes in his studies of power that those who cannot adapt their thinking are eventually crushed by the changing tides of reality. The toxic individual refuses to adapt, viewing flexibility as a sign of weakness rather than a hallmark of a highly developed and resilient mind. They often suffer from confirmation bias on a grand scale, only noticing the parts of a conversation that validate their existing personal grievances. This creates a narrative identity where they are perpetually persecuted by a world that fails to recognize their inherent brilliance or moral standing. The mind reinforces this by releasing dopamine when we feel we have won an argument, creating a literal addiction to being right. For the toxic person, this chemical reward is more important than the long-term health of their social circle or their personal reputation. They lack theory of mind, the ability to truly step inside another person's internal state and view the world through a different set of eyes. This deficiency means they are playing a game of chess where they are the only player who truly exists in their own mental model. Confidence is often confused with competence, and the toxic person uses a loud, unwavering voice to substitute for actual depth of knowledge. They have mastered the aesthetics of authority without ever doing the difficult internal work that true authority requires of a human being. The more they are challenged, the more they retreat into a siege mentality, where the entire world is seen as an enemy to be defeated. This psychological isolation is self-inflicted, yet they will blame the world for their loneliness, never looking inward for the primary source of the problem. The brutal realization we must eventually face is that toxic people do not see themselves as toxic. They see themselves as victims. Their brain is not functioning as a neutral observer of facts, but as a highly biased lawyer defending a client at all costs. They are limited by their own cognitive architecture, unable to process the complexity of human emotion or the necessity of mutual compromise. The human mind is designed to protect the self, and in some individuals, that protection mechanism has grown so large it smothers everything else. They are not necessarily trying to be evil. They are simply trying to remain emotionally intact in a world they find terrifyingly unpredictable. To admit they are wrong would be to admit that their entire worldview is a fragile construction, a thought too painful to entertain. We must understand that their certainty is a symptom of their limitation, a boundary they cannot cross without a radical, painful shift in consciousness. They are trapped in a prison of their own making, where the walls are built of I am right and the bars are you are wrong. This realization allows us to move from a state of reactive anger to a state of observational clarity and healthy emotional distance. We cannot change the cognitive structure of another person, especially if they do not believe a problem exists within their own mental framework. However, we can recognize that their behavior is a reflection of their internal struggle, not a definitive judgment on our own personal value. Understanding the why behind their toxicity doesn't excuse the behavior, but it does strip away the power they have to confuse us. Now, we must turn the analytical lens toward ourselves, for the human mind is a universal instrument prone to the same errors. Are there areas in your own life where you have become rigid, refusing to listen to the feedback of those who love you? Do you find yourself rewriting the history of a conflict to ensure that you are the one who emerges with a clean and virtuous record? Every mind is vulnerable to the siren song of certainty, as it provides a temporary relief from the vast ambiguity of our existence. We must ask ourselves, would I rather be right and alone, or would I rather be humble and deeply connected to others? Self-reflection is the only tool we have to prevent our own natural defensive mechanisms from hardening into a toxic and impenetrable shell. It requires a quiet courage to look at our own shadow and acknowledge that we, too, are capable of causing pain through our own self-righteousness. How many times have we ignored the truth simply because the person telling it was someone we had already decided was beneath our consideration? The antidote to this psychological trap is the cultivation of what we might call intellectual grace and a commitment to radical curiosity. This involves making a conscious choice to prioritize the search for truth over the immediate emotional satisfaction of winning a small social point. Humility is not the absence of confidence. It is the presence of an open mind that acknowledges its own inherent fallibility and limited perspective. By practicing emotional awareness, we can catch the moment our ego begins to flare up and choose to breathe instead of reacting with hostility. Recognizing our limitations is the first step toward genuine wisdom, allowing us to build relationships based on reality rather than on a defensive fantasy. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury," a reminder to stay open when others close. In a world that often rewards the loudest and most certain voices, there is a quiet, transformative power in the person who can say, "I might be wrong." This simple phrase is the key that unlocks the prison of the ego, allowing for growth, connection, and a deeper understanding of the human condition. We invite you to reflect on your own experiences with the always right phenomenon and how it has shaped your view of human nature. The journey towards self-awareness is long and often difficult, but it is the only path that leads to a life of true meaning and authentic peace. What would happen if, in your next disagreement, you focused entirely on finding the grain of truth in the other person's perspective?